This session focuses on sustainable and unsustainable consumption. We have been over the last couple of sessions nibbling around the edges of the issue of consumption, but this week we are going to plunge into it without reservation. For more than 40 years there has been reticence on the part of the economically advanced nations to come to terms with the social and ecological ramifications of their consumption practices. The prevailing view has been that more is always better, and this philosophy has served as the guiding light for virtually all facets of public policy and private decision-making. There have, to be sure, been small upwellings of resistance to this pervasive idea, but the effect of these social movements has been decidedly small and for the most part inconsequential. The last decade has, as we have seen, given rise to a surge of interest in enhancing the efficiency of production in various ways, and this has to some degree spilled over into what we might understand as the ecological modernization of consumption. In other words, the increasing efficiency of consumption practices. We have, though, highlighted in previous sessions the problems inherent in this singular emphasis on efficiency, the dilemmas that hold with respect to increasing efficiency in the production sphere also hold with respect to the realm of consumption. Notably, though, over the last 2 years, growing attention has come to be directed toward the complementary notion of sufficiency, and I will in this session outline the conceptual foundations of this perspective and explain how it has begun to unfold as a policy discourse. To get us started, I would like you to view 2 video clips that set out some of the context for the current discussion around moving contemporary consumption practices in more sustainable directions. These videos provide an overview of the policy challenges at the intersection of sustainability and consumption. With these short video clips as introduction, it is instructive to note that a research field has emerged over the past decade or so to study the social and environmental implications of household consumption. Books that have contributed to this work include the following pictured here, as well as, by latest tally, about 300 published journal articles. There is increasing evidence, as we will see, that some of this activity is now starting to move into the mainstream. The points of departure for considering the issue of sustainable consumption are 3 interlinked global problems, and we have discussed all of them in various ways already. First is the need to prepare for a global population of 9 to 10 billion people over the next 40 years. Second is the need to reconcile the huge disparities that exist in access to and utilization of global resources. Finally is the need to address global climate change and other global-scale environmental problems like water scarcity and biodiversity loss. The aim is to sharply reduce our per capita ecological footprint over the next 4 decades, especially in the affluent countries. And estimates of the extent of the required reduction range from factor 4 to factor 10 to factor 20 improvements. Given these circumstances, the last number of years have seen the gradual emergence of a new policy agenda organized around the notion of sustainable consumption. We don't have time today to go into all of this policy history, but a quick overview begins with the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 and Agenda 21, which included a chapter specifically devoted to the issue, to a series of workshops organized during the mid-1990s by the Nordic Council, a consortium of the 5 Nordic countries, that created a safe harbor to discuss the underlying politically volatile questions associated with sustainable consumption, to reports by the Royal Society of London in the UK and the National Academy of Sciences in the United States that set a scientific agenda around the issue of sustainable consumption, to a work program conducted under the auspices of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development during the 1990s, to a recent flurry of reports by several European governments and the European Environment Agency. The most visible manifestations today include something called the Marrakesh process, being carried out under the umbrella of the United Nations Environment Agency, and a parallel policy program being implemented by the European Commission. Despite growing recognition of the scale of the challenge, policymakers have been reticent to endorse initiatives that would impose explicit obligations on consumers. The essence of the dilemma is evocatively captured in a new book by a journalist named Heather Rogers, entitled Green Gone Wrong. Rogers writes that around the world, many politicians, the conventional energy sector, and manufacturers of all kinds oppose any major reduction in consumption. If people start using less, then economies based on consumption, such as that of the United States, where buying goods and services comprises 70% of all economic activity, will be forced to undergo a colossal transformation. Increasingly, it is the case that it is a way toward this colossal transformation that current scholarship on sustainable consumption seeks to chart. Nonetheless, there are numerous significant conceptual obstacles that need to be overcome, and as a result, to date, the emphasis, as indicated in the first of the 2 video clips that you viewed, has instead been on relatively modest voluntary initiatives calling for a combination of consumer education, eco-labeling, and household energy efficiency. There are also divisions within the field of sustainable consumption research over whether the normative aim is to pragmatically modify the quality of consumption or to endorse more radical measures to reduce its quantity. Second, the concept of sustainable consumption tends to get subsumed under its more politically agreeable companion notion, sustainable production. Third, it has been difficult to publicly critique consumption practices without inviting charges of interference with consumer sovereignty and the goal of continuous economic growth. Fourth, the issue of sustainable consumption opens up deep cleavages between developed countries, where the problem is one of overconsumption, and developing countries, where the problem is one of underconsumption. Fifth, the science of sustainable consumption remains contested over how to determine economic or biophysical thresholds of what might constitute a globally acceptable level of consumption, and more generally, the whole idea of ecologically imposed limits remains a difficult notion for people to recognize, regardless of what the science might point to. Sixth, the study of unsustainable consumption has tended to center on energy and material throughput and has neglected the macroeconomics of resource flows, which, as we will see, are critical for a broad understanding of the unsustainability of contemporary modes of consumption. The organization WorldWatch devoted the 2010 annual edition of its State of the World report to transforming consumer culture, and I would like you to take a brief break at this point to view 2 additional short video clips that feature a couple of the contributors to this volume. Current circumstances, marked by the ongoing aftermath of the global financial collapse, high unemployment that is not likely to resolve itself anytime soon, and protracted political paralysis over global climate change have led to the rediscovery of what are, at least to me, some interesting ideas. The last couple of years has seen the publication of a series of books that have pushed the intellectual envelope on sustainable consumption and have begun to put the issue of economic growth at the center of discussion and to transcend the preoccupation with relatively mild policy measures oriented in various ways around ideas associated with green consumerism, the premise that sustainable consumption is about buying greener products, and that from a policy perspective what is required is to encourage consumers to accept these goods into their lives. Specific examples of this emergent trend are Canadian Peter Victor's book Managing Without Growth, the French economist Serge Latouche's book Farewell to Growth, and a report written by a group led by the American ecological economist Bob Costanza entitled Beyond GDP, The Need for New Measures of Progress. Beyond the realm of more formal scholarship, we have over the past year seen the release, as we have discussed already, the report of the so-called Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission created by French President Nicolas Sarkozy, entitled Mismeasuring Our Lives, which provides a systematic critique of GDP as both a means of assessing economic growth and for evaluating well-being more generally, a path-breaking report by the London-based New Economics Foundation provocatively entitled Growth Isn't Possible, and another document issued by the European Commission and a group of partners entitled Beyond GDP. This outburst of activity raises questions about whether we are currently facing the rise of a new mode of Malthusian thinking, this time updated to account for the global financial collapse and the range of problems that have been created in its wake. We have talked already this semester at some length about the catalyzing role that was played by the best-selling report Limits to Growth, published in 1972, and the decade-long debate that it initiated about whether humanity was running a risk of transcending several key ecological thresholds. In a related spirit, we could inquire whether this raft of activity is an indication that we are giving in to our romantic inclinations and again falling under the spell of small is beautiful type thinking. I personally think that this pattern of thought rather represents what we can construe as the new political economy of consumption. And in the next several slides, I am going to lay out what I see as the tenets or the precepts of this emergent school of thought. The first point to make about the new political economy of consumption is that it is seated in an understanding of global macroeconomics. As previously noted, work thus far in the realm of sustainable consumption has been largely centered in what can be described as the sociology of consumption. And a couple of the readings assigned for this week are emblematic of this tradition. Another facet of research has been the social psychology of consumption and its efforts to understand how to more effectively encourage consumers to embrace certain patterns of green consumerism. There is also the work of industrial ecologists who detach themselves to a large degree from the social scientific influences of consumption and instead focus their attention on material and energy flows. The article distributed earlier this week on the life cycle impacts of electronic readers like Amazon's Kindle and Apple's iPad are excellent examples of this perspective. In summary, the new political economy of consumption is about finance and the role of money in its various forms in enabling contemporary forms of consumption and in providing the means to move throughput around the global economy. It is moreover essential to recognize, as was noted earlier, that the economic importance of consumers has expanded considerably over the last several decades. As indicated in the figure here, household consumption has grown from approximately 62% of GDP to over 70% today. Moreover, our consumption was at one time balanced against a reasonable savings rate. Despite fluctuations to account for variability in general economic conditions, Americans previously saved upwards of 8 to 10% of their income. During the late 1980s, this pattern shifted, and consumers in the United States came to rely on an increasing share of their income to maintain current lifestyles. My article assigned for this week, entitled The International Political Economy of Unsustainable Consumption and the Global Financial Collapse, outlines some of the reasons for this shift, so I will not go into them in detail here. Indeed, the bottoming out of this trend was reached in 2005 and 2006, when savings rates actually turned negative. In other words, incomes were no longer sufficient to maintain then current spending, so consumers began to deplete their savings to keep things going. At the same time, levels of personal debt that consumers took on began to explode at an exponential rate, in part as a result of the proliferation of credit cards and other relatively easily obtainable forms of credit. Looking at sources of debt more generally, total outstanding debt today in the United States is approximately 3.5 times GDP, a sharp divergence from the past and an indication that something transformational has occurred over the last 2 decades. It is the accumulation of this massive amount of debt that has enabled the United States to come to serve, as the media frequently likes to tell us, as the engine of the global economy. This situation also has given the American government the license to browbeat countries like Germany, France, and to some extent Japan for their allegedly high savings rates, and in the terms of American trade representatives, for under-consuming. Looked at from a slightly different perspective, the United States has come to serve, at least until recently, as the export destination of first and last resort for important parts of the rest of the world. Pushing this observation a bit further, it becomes apparent that the United States has managed to ensure the political acquiescence of its trading partners by mobilizing American consumers to serve as a kind of civilian army, ready and equipped to soak up other countries' surplus production. In other words, key allies like Germany, France, Canada are unable to challenge the political primacy of the United States out of fear of losing access to a critical export market upon which they have grown economically dependent. Accordingly, the American trade deficit, the difference between the country's imports and exports, and measured in terms of something called the current account balance, has increased markedly over the last 2 decades. At this point, it is useful to appropriate a term introduced by the historian Walter Russell Mead. Mead highlights the notion of sticky power as an alternative to the bipolar distinction between hard power, generally exemplified by military might, and soft power, generally exemplified by moral suasion and cultural attractiveness. Separate from these two customary forms of power is Mead's idea of sticky power, whereby the United States spins spider-like webs that capture other countries in ways that prompt them to, without the need for overt pressure, to uphold American political interests. This model has clearly reached its limit, and has led to no shortage of discussion over the last year or two over what is going to replace the motive power of the American consumer in the global economy. The leading candidate, obviously, is the Chinese consumer, with all of the problems that continued movement toward a mass consumption society in China holds. This situation, though, needs to be examined against a broader background, about which much has been said in recent months, namely the deteriorated and deteriorating status of the United States government's financial situation. Outstanding federal debt, the blue line in the graph here, has been over the past decade more than doubled as a percentage of GDP. The Obama administration's future budget projections have advanced some rather rosy scenarios whereby the amount of debt is projected to stabilize. But this seems highly unlikely to materialize, and there is really no basis for such pie-in-the-sky projections. The federal budget deficit, the orange line in the graph, is presently more than 12% of GDP, and without some very sizable tax increases, extremely unlikely, or increases in federal revenues, also extremely unlikely, there is little reason to expect that the upward trend will not continue. However, the real risk that we face is if interest rates start to move higher and it becomes increasingly more expensive for the federal government to finance this outsized debt load, which it is regularly forced to roll over on a short-term basis. In fact, this is only a partial portrayal of the unfolding financial future of the United States. More importantly, it does not include the cost of covering the medical expenses of the now retiring generation of baby boomers. We have to factor into the equation the amount of money that we will need to spend on Medicare and Medicaid expenses over the next several decades. These expenditure categories are set to grow by a factor of 3, and amount to aggregated in-kind debt obligations of more than $50 trillion. These are already promised expenditures, and they are as real as the next mortgage or rental payment that you personally need to make on your house. In other words, it is inconceivable that these benefits will be significantly curtailed. With respect to sustainability of the United States, there is a real elephant in the room that no one really wants to acknowledge. This set of circumstances has led another historian, Neil Ferguson, to observe that the United States has now settled into the strange status of being a debtor empire. Countries have historically accrued debt of the order of magnitude that the United States has taken on only during times of major wars. While the ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan are imposing extensive and largely hidden financial burdens, it is inaccurate to describe them as cases that have threatened the political sovereignty of the country, as was the case, say, for Britain during World War II. Ferguson has gone on to further note that the United States is, from a financial standpoint, in the anomalous situation of fighting a world war without the war. So in terms of sustainable consumption, what we are witnessing at the moment is a turn from what we can construe as relatively weak sustainable consumption to relatively strong sustainable consumption. With respect to the two figures here, recognition is accruing that the customary pursuit of infinite economic growth is giving way to a new conception informed by the ideals of a steady-state economy, as presented in the work of ecological economists like Herman Daly, whereby the economy is embedded in society, and society is in turn embedded in the biosphere. This is surely still a radical idea with respect to the mainstream, but the fact that a new public debate is developing, as we will see, is an interesting and compelling step forward. This distinction between weak and strong sustainable consumption can be more extensively articulated along the following lines. First criteria is the point of departure, the difference in the point of departure between weak sustainable consumption and strong sustainable consumption. The point of departure under weak sustainable consumption is the enhancement of the consumer experience through quality improvement. In contrast, the point of departure for a perspective premised on the ideas of strong sustainable consumption is that there is a need for deep reductions of material throughput that are consistent with factor 4 or factor 10 or factor 20 improvements. The disciplinary or interdisciplinary orientation of weak sustainable consumption is grounded in behavioral economics, consumer psychology, and social psychology, whereas the disciplinary and interdisciplinary orientation of strong sustainable consumption is in sustainability science and socio-technical transition management studies. From a motivation standpoint, weak sustainable consumption is about promoting consumer rationality and engineering redesign, whereas strong sustainable consumption takes its moral impetus from a coercion-based approach centered on impinging ecological constraints. The conceptual foci of weak sustainable consumption is eco-labeling, consumer education, energy efficiency, public procurement, whereas the conceptual foci of strong sustainable consumption is on social practices, ecological citizenship, democratic engagement, innovative governance, and alternative systems of economic organization. The strategic emphasis of weak sustainable consumption is about promoting more informed consumer decision-making. The strategic emphasis of strong sustainable consumption is about reconfiguring global supply chains and relocalizing household provisioning. The political orientation of weak sustainable consumption is pragmatic, and, at least thus far, the political organization of strong sustainable consumption is idealistic. The overwhelming objective of weak sustainable consumption is to promote incremental improvement using established policy tools, and the overriding objective of strong sustainable consumption is on individual societal well-being within biophysical limits. Let me try to highlight how this mode of strong sustainable consumption is being expressed by looking at 3 recent reports, the last of which, by Tim Jackson, we will look at in much greater detail over the next 2 weeks. We will start with a document entitled Living Beyond Our Means by Jonathan Porritt. Porritt is a venerable figure within the ranks of British environmentalism. After involvement with the Green Party, formerly the Ecology Party in the UK, and several years as director of the UK branch of Friends of the Earth, Porritt co-founded an organization called Forum for the Future in 1996. The group quickly became a fixture in both domestic and international policy discussions, and he currently serves as a prominent sustainability champion through a welter of interlocking positions on governmental and quasi-governmental bodies. The point here is that he is by no means a member of the radical fringe of contemporary environmentalism or sustainability thinking, but rather a well-accepted and upstanding member of what we can think of as the political establishment. Porritt narrates a documentary on consumption and consumerism that I have included at the end of this session, so you will have more time and a more extensive opportunity to familiarize yourself with him at that time. Let me here, though, provide a brief summary of this report before we move on to talk about 2 other reports, one entitled Socially Sustainable Economic Degrowth, and then finally Tim Jackson's report, Prosperity Without Growth. So first, living within our means. A brief summary of living within our means begins with a recognition that the ecological crisis and the credit crisis are linked, and together they will precipitate what Porritt describes as the ultimate recession induced by global climate change. He also notes that biophysical debt and financial debt are inseparable. Third, there is a strange incompatibility between the urgency surrounding the bailout of financial institutions and global climate change. Fourth, the contemporary commitment to economic growth, Porritt contends, is predicated on articles of faith. The economic system has been artificially perpetuated by deregulation, debt accumulation, cost externalization, undervaluation of risk, short-term decision-making, and diminishment of democratic engagement. Finally, the chronic mismatch between productive and consumptive capacities creates needs to continually stoke demand through the permissive use of credit, the deployment of blanket advertising, and the encouragement of insidious forms of status consciousness. Recommendations or insights that come out of the report living within our means include the following: that we need to realign economic growth with biophysical constraints by launching a Green New Deal predicated on energy efficiency, renewables development, green-collar jobs, the renewal of natural capital, and ecological tax reform. Porritt also notes that ecological modernization-led modes of creative destruction have a downside that creates serious political challenges. Significant questions surround environmentally prudent investments because of the potential to increase levels of consumption, albeit on a slightly greener basis. This recommendation or this insight echoes points that we've already made with respect to the inevitability of rebound effects. There's also a need to acknowledge that absolute decoupling, the delinking of economic growth and materials utilization, is a myth. And we need to recognize that economic growth undermines the well-being of a majority of the world's population while simultaneously perpetuating financial risks and promoting ecological harms. A second example of strong sustainable consumption is articulated in a document generated under the auspices of the so-called degrowth movement. Most extensively established in France and going by the term décroissance for French speakers in our group, it has begun to spread to the rest of Europe and even to North America over the last year or so. Indeed, interest in degrowth has begun to take on some of the trappings of a more fully fledged social movement that is seeking to give political expression to the steady-state ideas of scholars like Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen and Herman Daly. Indeed, a political party has been created in France to advance this agenda and has attracted a surprising amount of attention in recent months. I will ask you to take a look at a couple of articles at the end of this session that will give you a sense of the spread of these ideas to a popular audience. So what is it that the degrowth movement has to say? Well, echoing many of the concerns already articulated by Jonathan Porritt, degrowthists are highly critical of both Keynesian and neoliberal models of productivism of the global economy. Namely, the idea that we need to expand consumption to meet ever-growing capacities to produce. Economic and social policies that continue to induce consumption growth through the implementation of tax reductions, banking deregulation, unfettered advertising, inevitably lead to a dead end because it is futile to continue to premise improvements in societal well-being on ever larger energy and material flows. Degrowthists also argue that we need to promote policies that encourage economic downsizing, or what in the language of degrowth is oftentimes expressed as right-sizing. Economic downsizing entails the regulation of working hours, the provision of greater labor market flexibility, the mandating of compensation for annual vacations, prolonged illnesses, and parental leave, the creation of a citizen's income, the imposition of restrictions on advertising, and the design of more durable and repairable products. Finally, degrowthists also seek to encourage scalable social experimentation that creates opportunities to test the viability of their policies. The degrowth agenda furthermore includes consideration of the need to revise standard modes of national accounting, as we have discussed in some length, and in particular to address the defects in GDP calculations. Second, degrowthists contend that we need as a society to move beyond efficiency as a core sustainability strategy, because such gains will be undermined by inevitable rebound effects. Planetary growth capacity must be redistributed from affluent to poor countries. Third, the degrowth agenda seeks to catalyze a more robust social movement to overcome what in European circles is referred to as productivism, or in some cases as economism, in contemporary life, and to conceptualize human motivations in less reductionistic ways. In other words, to transcend atomized models of social action and to view human interaction as more than a collection of economic transactions, as is all too often the case today. Let us finally move on to a brief overview of what is in many respects the most fully developed macroeconomics of unsustainable consumption thus far produced. Tim Jackson, a leading British environmental social scientist, begins his conceptual understanding by observing that among consumers there is an endless quest for novelty. One of the most important ways that we convey our social standing or our status to others is by demonstrating innovation in our consumption practices. More specifically, a powerful aspect of human ambitions, even more pronounced than consumer societies characterized by relatively high levels of income inequality, is to differentiate our consumption from others. For a recent and provocative example, again, just look at what happened this past weekend as part of the release of Apple's new iPad, where people stood on long lines to have the opportunity to purchase one, though these lines were not as long as the ones that formed 3 years ago around Apple's iPhone. Business firms face a reciprocal pressure to pursue endless innovation as part of the process of competitive enterprise. A key tenet of contemporary economics is one that is largely true, is that managers that fail to innovate their products with sufficient pace, either superficially or substantively, face extinction in the marketplace. We thus have an economy that is organized, according to Jackson, for all intents and purposes, as a perpetual motion machine. On one hand, producers innovate, so they have a platform of products that can be promoted as new as a matter of simple survival. On the other hand, consumers are trapped in a similar cycle, whereby social success is predicated on one's ability to be continually innovative. When we put these two energetic systems together, we get the fateful logic of the contemporary economy, and an economy that is designed to encourage maximal novelty to keep the fateful logic of the system in motion. What then do we do? One idea put forward by Jackson and echoed by the others that we've described here today is to pursue a Green New Deal that could be as equally transformative as the original New Deal was in the United States during the 1930s. Another idea is to recognize that contemporary consumption is a form of hedonism, albeit an economically and socially problematic form of it. We need to develop ways for consumers to pursue what has been described as alternative hedonism, as a way to escape the vicious cycle of working and spending. A third idea, one that we have discussed before, is to encourage public policies that shorten the work week as a way to allocate labor more fairly and to, at the same time, reduce the relentless pressure that leads to endless surplus production and pressure to push more of this production down to consumers using every available means. Fourth, we can promote policies aimed at reducing social inequality and stemming status-fueled consumption. Finally, we can shift investment priorities to favor public over private goods. As a general rule, public investments in, say, transportation, recreational alternatives, and so forth will be far more preferable from a sustainability standpoint than will their private counterparts. I have posted 3 articles to the course website that speak to the fact that an increasingly public discussion is starting to take place around the notion of unsustainable consumption. The first is a book review of the soon-to-be-published book by the journalist Heather Rogers that we spoke about before, entitled Green Gone Wrong. The second is a recent column that appeared last month in an issue of Newsweek. The third is about an academic conference that was held last year in Syracuse around the emergent field of biophysical economics. Lastly, I would like you to view a documentary produced by Jonathan Porritt as part of a series called Ideas That Change the World that was broadcast a short time ago on British television. The download of the video is broken into 4 pieces, and you will need to load and view each one in sequence. Once you have watched this approximately 35-minute documentary, you will have reached the end of this session.